Hello Bendigo, how are we this morning? It's so good to see you at the Bendigo Climate Summit. What an extravaganza today of vital conversations. And in this session, which they have called the Great Transport Debate, and I'm hoping that some of the debate might actually come from you in the room. Via your input on the Slido platform, we would love your questions for this session because this is your town and the questions are concerning your daily lives and how you move around this place. But in this session, with this fantastic panel who I'm about to introduce, we are asking, as a regional city, can Bendigo lead the way to become Australia's first zero transport emissions city by 2030. Ambitious. Victoria has just released its 2035 emissions reduction target plan, and the Climate Council has also just released a massive report on shifting to cleaner transport. So in many ways, Bendigo is already leading the way by having this very conversation today. So what could a zero emissions transport system in your town look and feel like, and why try for it at all? That's what we're going to unpack with three world leaders in this realm today. On Djadjawarrung and Tangerang country, people have been travelling across this place for tens of thousands of years, building communities, adapting to their environment. And this week, the Djadjawarrung community released the Turning Wrong Way Climate Right Way action plan, which will be well worth looking at. I gather there are copies out in the foyer today to have a look at. So really, in that spirit, this event feels like it is very much part of a long story of how people live on this country and how we live, and more particularly how we move around, has become a huge contributor to global warming. A fifth of the warming gases that we humans spew into the atmosphere come from planes and trains and trucks and automobiles and ships. And in Bendigo, this is interesting, nearly a fifth of the city's greenhouse gas emissions come from cars. A fifth. More than 95% of travel in Bendigo is by cars. And that's understandable. Why not? Because cars are convenient and they're fast and you can whip around town, you can whip out of town, you head down to Melbourne, you can drop people off at school, you can get to work, it makes sense. And catching buses in Bendigo, I know, is pretty tricky. It's slow, they don't get you to where you need to be when you want to be there. And what about bike lanes? How do you feel about riding bikes in Bendigo? Does that feel like a safe option? And what about walking? So much to talk about here. And we have incredible panellists. We are so privileged to have these three. One of them's a local, lucky you. And we've got two others who are attending Bendigo, but are world leaders on these issues. Sara Stace is what you call yourself a city shaper. She is much in demand as a global leader in urban strategy and planning and in active transport like walking and cycling. She's Director of Cities with the management and consultancy firm WSP Global. She's worked with federal, state, local governments, the UN, the private sector for over 25 years, and she's just back from Europe where she's got some stories to tell us about. Elliot Fishman is a sustainable transport planner and founder of the consultancy, I love this title, the Sensible Transport Institute. He's advised the OECD, governments from New York City to London to Singapore and across Australia on reducing transport emissions, reducing car use, innovations like electric vehicle use, bike share programs and beyond. And Peter Bourke is your very own. He's Executive Officer with We Ride Australia, advocating at the national level for bike riding and riders. And also at the local level with Bike Bendigo. Who's a member of Bike Bendigo in the room? Yes, excellent, represent. Really aiming to make bike riding easy, accessible, inclusive for all people of all ages and abilities. And he's also, as it happens, General Manager of the peak body for the bicycle industry, which is interesting. Let's give them a big warm welcome. We really want your questions for this session. I'm going to be looking on the screen here, the screen there, so pop them into the Slido platform as explained, and we'd love to hear from you. I'm going to weave them in at some point. Let's start with our panel. So just a really quick fire response to why this is an essential conversation to be having. Why would we be thinking about zero transport emissions for a regional town like Bendigo by, say, 2030, 2035, let's hope by 2050. Sara?
I think there are a few factors that we want to take into account. One of those is climate, which is why we're here, but the other ones are health and the environment generally, so pollution. When we talk about health, that's probably one of the major reasons, because there are study after study globally and in Australia that show that when people live healthy, active lives, and generally walking or riding for recreation is good, but it's even better if it's incidental exercise, as you're walking to the shops and so on. But that has major health benefits and can extend your life by 2 to 5 years. It reduces mortality, reduces risk of diabetes, heart disease, dementia and so on. So it's actually personally good for everybody.
It's good for you. This is a good start. Do we do things that are good for us all the time though? That's an interesting question. Elliot, what about you?
Yeah, well, look, I think in addition to all the reasons that Sara mentioned, I think one of the main things that we often forget is that the reason we live in cities and the reason we live in townships right across Australia is because humans enjoy interaction with other humans. That's why cities came about 12 or 18,000 years ago, is because we need interaction, social interaction, economic interaction. So we're communities and we live together. And when you have communities and transport systems that prioritise people and place, then you get better cities and people want to be there. And so it's of huge importance in terms of the success of cities and making it a city that people want to go to, because in this post-COVID era, people can move about and work remotely, and so people are going to choose places to live based on how good that town is to live in, and creating quality places that people enjoy living in is going to be really important. And so creating a city where walking, cycling and public transport becomes the first choice rather than car use being the only choice is something that is going to be increasingly valuable in the future.
We've leapt to the solution, but the problem that we're trying to solve is the question of getting transport down to zero emissions. What's the imperative there?
Well, we need to do a lot of things fast, because in actual fact we should have been doing this 20 years ago and we've really only just started now, so we've started far too late. But to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge that we've got, even if every single car that was purchased from tomorrow onwards in Australia was electric and zero emission, we still wouldn't meet our 2030 emissions targets, the national target of 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, because there are so many cars in our fleet that are internal combustion engine, and people hold on to their cars for about 15 to 20 years. So we've got this huge problem, and we're going to overshoot our emissions in transport by a long way, and that's why we need to look at not just the challenge of shifting internal combustion engine cars to electric, but also what can we do to bring public transport to be a more attractive choice, and for walking and cycling to be prioritised, especially for trips that are 0 to 5 kilometres, and most trips in Australian townships are under 5 kilometres, and a lot of people are surprised by that. So even though we're a big country, a lot of our trips every day are very short enough to do by walking or cycling if the environment was safe enough and attractive enough to compel people to do that.
Yes, and we'll interrogate the question of electric vehicles. They're certainly part of the solution, a vital part of the solution, but they're not a panacea, and that's a really interesting set of questions to explore. Peter Bourke, what about you? What's the imperative? I know you're a hardcore cyclist, you love biking, but this is part of a bigger story for you too.
Absolutely, and thank you, and it's great to be here. And it's an interesting, I'll just come back to your comment about I'm a hardcore cyclist, which is actually a really interesting question. I do ride the K&a-half to school and kinder with my children. If you call that a hardcore cyclist, I'm happy to be called that.
Good point.
But yeah, so to me, and on that, anyone who rides a bike to me is a bike rider. And in COVID, there was 11 million people that said they rode a bike during COVID, the year of COVID. So it's not an extreme activity. It is just, as Sara has pointed out, a day-to-day activity that we need to be focusing on. But to come back to the question about why we need to do this, obviously Elliot, Sara, fantastic, agree with everything they've said, so the debate's already gone out the window. But it's also about equity and equality. It's about providing solutions. It's about providing an opportunity for everybody in your city to be able to get to where they need to get to. And that is the shop, and that is the chemist, that is the whatever it might be, the school. But it's providing those solutions so that everybody, they don't have to have a car, they have an opportunity to get to where they need to go. And one of the things that's really scary about this discussion, and Elliot mentioned that we're 20 years behind already, we've known the solutions for years. The solutions have always been around, whether that's public transport, whether that's public active travel. We've known that we need to be moving down this path for a long time.
So active travel like biking, walking, scootering?
Sorry, thank you. Yes, active travel. It's anything that gets the body moving to get you to your destination. We've known that we need to invest in these, and it's just a case of we need to have, for the leadership, we need to have that investment to actually provide the solutions and, as Elliot said, to provide access to the choices. Some people need to drive, there is no question about that, but there's a lot of people that don't, but they don't feel safe to do something else, so we need to provide the choices, and that's probably one thing we need to focus on is providing the opportunity for everybody to access where they need to go in their local community.
Yes, the safety question is an interesting one. Sara, Stace, a lot of people say, and in fact, I gather that 30% of peak hour traffic in Bendigo is people dropping their children or picking up their children from school. And one of the reasons that parents do that is that they don't feel it's safe for their children either to travel to school on other modes of transport like the bike or walking. It's also efficient to get to school in a car with, a busy morning, got to get the kids to school that way. Is that kind of a vicious circle? Because in fact, the more people who do that, the more cars there are on the road, less safe the roads are for kids.
Yeah, it's definitely an unvirtuous circle. I guess there's a few factors at play there. There's one, you talked about efficiency. So at the local school that my kids go to, in fact, there's very little parking outside the school. There's certainly none in the school. And so, in fact, families have switched to riding the cargo bike. So I've got one as well. You just pop the kids on the back, you can fit 2 or 3 kids and you ride down to the school and drop them off. So, and then you can continue on to work, and at no point did you have to worry about bus timetables or parking. So from an efficiency point of view, there are alternatives, but there also have to be some disincentives, like it's hard to park, or you don't want to get caught up in traffic snarls. So that's one aspect. I think the other one that we need to think about is, what does that teach our children? So if kids are growing up and they're walking or riding to school when it's, safe for them to do so, perhaps in their teenage years, they are learning a lifelong habit. And so when we're continuing to drop them off at school right through their years, when do they learn? When are they going to break free from the shackles of the seatbelt? So I think that's really important for us to consider. It's actually about our kids' freedom. And right up until they're 17 or 18, children can't drive. And likewise, as people approach, into their senior years, they want to be driving less and less, and at some point need to give up their licence. And so when we create a city and suburbs that force you to drive, you're then forcing all those people into their homes or needing to rely on others. And from an equity point of view, the average car ownership is about $10,000 a year. That's according to Australian government statistics.
The cost?
The cost. That includes the car purchase and depreciation, insurance, tolls, parking, petrol. So when you add all of those up, that's a lot of money. So I think, when we're thinking much more about that broader social justice and who has access, it's children, it's seniors, and it's people who actually, for whom owning a car is expensive. How do we cater for those?
Let's just consider Bendigo now and Bendigo in the future. Around 122,000 people own 82,000 cars in Bendigo. A fifth of Bendigo households have 3 or more cars. No shame in this, I'm totally car dependent, I have to agree. But 2050, let's think about where we're heading in Bendigo. the projected population increase is upwards of 200,000 by 2050. If the car ownership trends continue, that's 140,000 cars in 2050. So that's a lot of cars, a lot of traffic, a lot of car parks, a lot of cars sitting sedentary in car parks in the city, because most people drive their cars to work in Bendigo as well. And this is the story of regional towns across Australia. So what does that mean for a city's vibe, a city's relationships? Elliot?
Well, it's difficult to think of a city that has lots and lots of surface car parking that is also a really vibrant, people-orientated place that is fun to walk around and be in. So when you think of a place like, the obvious example that a lot of transport planners use is a city like Houston in Texas, where something like 50% of all urban land is actually car parking. And a lot of Australian cities aren't that different. So because cars occupy a huge amount of space and they sit idle 96% of the time, so they're just sitting there, and when you've got large swathes of car park, it really does reduce the vibrancy and the economic and cultural vitality of a place. So you can't get a successful, people-orientated, vibrant township and have a lot of car parking in the centre of that town. Those two things don't work together. So for a lot of those regular trips, like to work, where you're taking 240 days a year, typically you would work, so that's about 500 trips there and back per year. That's a lot of car trips, and what we need to start doing is creating a public transport system that makes it easier for people to be able to get into those townships for work without the need to always use the car. So it's about, I guess, finding the right tool for the job. So sometimes the car is going to be by far and away the best option for you. So if you're going on a road trip, or you're taking all your kids to visit their grandparents in the country.
Or you're going about your business.
Yep. Yeah, so if you're a plumber or an electrician or something and you really are dependent on a car, the car is the right tool for the job. But if you're a single occupant person taking a 3-kilometre trip to the office, a transport system should be able to provide a better option for you, so you don't need to do that, so you're not dependent upon the car for that sort of trip. And then that makes it easier for those that do need to use their car. So if you are a plumber or an electrician, you can move around the city more easily, do more jobs, find a car park more easily. So it's about creating a system that diversifies transport options so that people can choose the right tool for the transport job that they've got at hand.
Okay. Elliot Fishman just mentioned public transport. I'm going to do a quick survey of the auditorium here. Who catches public transport in Bendigo? Hands up. Okay, that's a definite minority in the room. Who catches a bus? Yes, probably the same people. What about the train? Oh, lots. Inside Bendigo? No, to get to Melbourne, to get to Castlemaine, etc. Yeah, so public transport. Peter Bourke, you're the local. Are you a regular user of public transport?
Unfortunately, I have to admit on this one, I've never been inside a bus, a Bendigo bus. I am a train user to Melbourne, but being local, I've done my time in Melbourne and Sydney, and so I understand the congestion elements of those towns. But coming back to the regional centres, you fall back into the natural habit of the car. I can get anywhere I want to get to at any time, even if it is just at 500 metres down the road to get some milk. So the public transport, the bus system, for two things.
Describe it for us.
Yeah, it wouldn't be as efficient as I would like it to be for my needs. And to be perfectly honest, it's not something that I've ever actually considered, because it's not the norm in our current city. So my social networks don't describe using the bus, so therefore it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They don't talk about it, we don't talk about it. It doesn't exist in my mind as an option to get to where I want to go. And
that's probably the reality for a lot of people, that it's not serving their needs, their daily living needs.
Correct. And that is one of the challenges with public transport. It is something that needs to be efficient, effective, and get you where you want to go or need to go in a timely manner. And It is serving many, so of course it doesn't suit everybody, but it is a challenge to get an effective network. We're very lucky in a lot of locations that we have fantastic public transport, but our gaps between services may be too far for people to wait that half hour or that hour. And so therefore they then choose to use the car. And then, of course, we've got the self-fulfilling prophecy of we don't use the bus.
It's cold, it's wet, winter's coming.
There's no
waiting
shelter
at a bus
waiting
stop.
for me. Yes, there's no shelter. And then if I miss one, I'm now waiting half an hour for the next one.
Elliot Fishman from the Sensible Transport Institute, you're raising your eyebrows about public transport.
I think there's a thing that happens, it happens in Bendigo, but it happens in lots of regional cities, and it actually happens in some of the larger metropolitan cities as well, and it's an accounting trick where the Transport Department have said, well, we want to increase the proportion of households that have access to a bus that are within, say, 100 metres or 200 metres of a bus route. And so what they do then is, rather than running more bus routes, they simply change the bus routes so that they become more circuitous and run down really small local streets and meander through suburbs. And the problem with that is that even though you meet your metric of 80% of households living within 100 metres of a bus route, the problem is those bus routes then, instead of taking, say, 15 minutes to get from people's origin to destination, now take 50 minutes.
No, it's like going on a grand epic adventure just to get to work.
Exactly, and so then people, they weigh up the pros and the cons of the different modes that are available to them, and they make their choice based on convenience and speed and cost. And what they'll compare is a 10-minute car trip to a 50-minute bus trip, and they'll pick the car every time if they've got that option available to them. And most people do, and so most people use the car. And that's the problem of being tricky with the accounting and trying to rejig your bus route to be so close to everyone's home. You end up creating a system that only appeals to a very small number of people.
Just to paint the picture for people beyond the room, because we are recording this event as well, Bendigo does have a train line. It connects Bendigo to the nearby Goldfields town here in central Victoria, to Castlemaine and then on to Melbourne. And there are some stops in Bendigo. There's also a massive 4-lane highway that kind of runs from one side of Bendigo to the other, from Kangaroo Flat to Epsom. And, are there options here for creating a thriving public transport option or series of options? We've got some great questions coming through from the audience. And these are our prompts. What about electric buses are being built in Brisbane and Adelaide? What is stopping us ordering some this year? Bus companies need federal, state and local support and laws. So what about a rapid transit bus system? That's often held up as a fantastic option. Sara?
Yeah, I would just say, I guess this week I was going through some suburbs in Sydney, not right in the centre, and heading down towards the port area, so not a hugely high density area. And we were able to just hop on and off buses that were express buses. There's no timetable because it is literally a turn up and go system. So every 4 to 10 minutes it is guaranteed there's going to be a bus.
Imagine.
And some are electric, some petrol. So the electric bus is nice, but it's not going to solve those problems. In this case, they've completely re-timetabled all of the buses in the area. And you now know that you're going to have these bus routes that are just going to turn up and go. And it wasn't even the same route. We actually combined a few different routes together. So you can just wander off, go and have a coffee, come back to the bus stop, catch the next one. It was just amazing. So it can be done, but then exactly as Elliot was saying, these routes aren't wandering and meandering throughout little suburban streets. They were going right down the sort of trunk routes.
They're getting on with business. So people have to get to those stops to access the transport. Peter Newman, the transport guru in Western Australia, is a great fan of what are called trackless trams, essentially fancy electric buses, aren't they? And you could imagine in a town like Bendigo that you could have a trackless tram running down that kind of central highway. Could that work, Elliot Fishman?
Yeah, look, trackless trams, it's a little bit like a laser-guided bus. So it's still a bus, but a laser-guided bus. And you can create electric trackless trams as well, laser-guided buses. And the key thing is providing a dedicated right-of-way, so they're not stuck in general traffic lanes. They have their own dedicated lane, and that's critical because what it does is increase transport reliability in terms of the speed that the bus can go, so it can stick to a timetable, doesn't get caught up in the local traffic issues that motor vehicles will. And then if you provide high-frequency buses, then it gives people the comfort to know that if they turn up, they'll never have more than, say, 9 or 10 minutes to wait before the next bus comes, even if they miss one. So it's got to be high frequency and it's got to have a dedicated right-of-way. But the dedicated right-of-way brings up a really difficult problem for a lot of cities, not just regional cities, but also capital cities, and that is how to allocate road space to different modes of transport, because at the moment, over 95% of our road space is dedicated to motor vehicles, and almost all of our trips that take place in cities and regional towns are by private passenger vehicles. So it raises important questions about how you allocate that space, because it's a very, there's a lot of competing tensions around that space. And if you take away a motor vehicle traffic lane and give it over to a dedicated bus lane, there'll be some people that will argue, well, that will increase congestion. But what we need to do, and this is not a position that I expect many people in the audience will agree with, we need to forget about the idea of solving congestion. We're never going to solve congestion, and if we put in policies that try and solve congestion, you'll actually increase your chances of getting congestion because it dedicates so much transport resources to one particular mode of transport, the motor vehicle. So trackless trams, I think, would be a really good idea in regional cities, but you need to run them regularly enough to provide a compelling value proposition so that people feel confident that they can leave their cars at home, or perhaps even getting to 18 or 19 years old, which has typically been a rite of passage to go and then buy a car, and then you use that car for almost every trip, to actually have the confidence to turn 18 and not buy a car. And that's really the sign of success, that city planners have been able to create a transport system that is diversified enough that it isn't so reliant on just one particular mode of transport.
Peter Bourke, John in the audience has asked, can we bring train shuttles to small stations along our existing rail lines in central Victoria? At the moment, they're the big V-line intercity trains. What about another option, a sort of smaller, intimate option for Bendigo itself?
It'd be awesome to see increased usage of trains. Obviously, that I'll be honest, I don't understand the full economics of having those small shuttles on those tracks. As a user of trains, I would love to see it, and I believe that it would be beneficial. But of course, it comes down to a political decision and the economics of that decision. So if we can achieve that, that would be amazing to do. But I'd actually just like to expand something on what I just said then, is something we haven't really touched on here. We came here to talk about climate collaboration. One of the underlying drivers of all the decisions that we are making is economics. And the question was, why do we need to do this? And economics, we can't afford not to, financially wise. We're doing some work out of a webinar next week with Sara, with what's happening in China. They are doing a lot of work, economic rationalisation of their transport system, and aiming at 70% mode share away from motor vehicles, because economically they say that's the way forward for them. If we don't make these decisions, whether it's health, whether it's congestion, whether it's environment, if we don't make these changes, if we don't move to trackless trams, or we don't provide road space for the moving people, not just moving private motor vehicles, cities such as Bendigo will suffer economically. So that's what we need to do to be a place people want to live, a place where people want to prosper. That's actually coming back to the original question of why it is all about. It's not all about, but economics is a big driver, and if we don't do it, we will suffer economically.
Let's unpack that further. Sarah, Stace.
Yeah, so that's right. The Chinese government is investing a lot in cycling infrastructure. So historically, the Chinese cities have been used to have a lot of bike riding, probably 30 or 40 years ago, and then they very much pushed that away. They were like, oh, actually, these bikes are blocking cars from driving. We're going to invest a lot in building roads and building train lines, particularly metro. But then they've come to realise that represents a major spatial challenge, because if everybody's in their big, large car, that has a real geometric problem. Where do you fit all these cars? And then also, how do people get to the metro station? Just like here, how do people get to your major public transport trunk routes? They need to be able to walk or cycle to get there. So in a very sort of logical sort of format, they've gone, actually, well, we do really need to invest in cycling and walking, and they're not doing it in a small scale, they're doing it on a massive scale, sort of in the thousands of kilometres of cycleways. So I think what we're noticing with cities all around the world, Paris has just done this, Odense, Oslo, there are cities all around the world where they're saying, look, we need to make a trade-off. And I'm going to be very controversial here. That trade-off is parking, car parking. So I'm going to guess that amongst our audience here, when you're living in a regional city or town, you would expect that when you drive, we had this last night, didn't we, Peter? When you drive to go to the shop or the doctor or the library or the school, you kind of expect that you're going to be able to park right outside the front door. And that comes at a massive cost, because when you then go to say, hey, look, we want to put a cycleway in or a footpath or a wider share path, and people say no because I'm going to lose my parking.
Well, and shopkeepers say, well, hang on, we're going to lose our customers.
But actually, people who walk or ride spend more at the shops. So it's actually good for business. And I can see Peter's got a bit of a smile on his face. But I just wanted to say, when we put that parking right up front and say we cannot lose any of it, I'm not going to walk an extra sort of minute to get to the shop because I want to be able to park right outside. What you're doing is you're literally voting with your feet. You're saying, it does not matter to me that my kids need to be able to walk to school. It does not matter to me that teenagers can't get around without being driven. It's more important for me to park right outside the front. And I think that's a real problem that we need to deal with.
I want to come back to some international case studies because you've just come back from Europe and you were tweeting the most incredible photos. It was like some sort of fantasy land, but it's reality about how people can change their transport habits if the city supports them to do so. Peter Bourke, and then I'll come to you, Elliot.
No, I was just going to say there's a quote that we hear a lot is cars don't spend money, people do. And so there's lots of studies around, and the main one I quote is out of Lygon Street, where a car space generates about $900 of economic activity. When it's a car space, when that was transferred to bike parking, it averaged about $1,700 of economic activity in the same period of time across the day. So again, we come back to economics. That's something that we certainly need to talk about. And just one comment to Sara. Unfortunately, I was the driver last night who drove around the block to get a much closer park outside the pub. But one thing about Bendigo, there's 11,500 or over 11,000 car parks in the centre of Bendigo. If we're talking about 24,000, I think the number was 24,000 car trips into Bendigo every day. So obviously there's a shortage there. But if we go close to doubling the population and we double the number of cars, it'll cost $10,000 per car park every time we want a new one. So is that something that we can afford to invest in? We already have, I think the quote was 22 Queen Elizabeth ovals, which is a local footy oval for those listening. We already have 22 of those ovals in car parking in the centre of Bendigo. Do we want to hand over more space to car parking, and can we afford to, so that people like me can drive around and get a car park outside the front door?
It's kind of weird, isn't it, too, that we drive our cars quite a short distance and then we leave them all day sitting stationary, alone, in a car park, and then we do the same to get back home again. If only there were easier ways to get to work, then our cars could just stay at home and be quite comfortable, thank you very much. They'd have to be lonely in a car park in the middle of the city. Sorry, I'm anthropomorphising cars here. That's probably not a good idea.
And also, just to add, as Elliot said, over 50% of the trips in regional centres, such as Bendigo, are less than 4.5 kilometres. So the engine doesn't even get warm by the time we tuck it up and leave it for the day before we go to work and then get it out and roll it out again. We don't even give it a chance to warm up.
But what's most important is that personal cars and commercial vehicles are an enormous contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions across the planet, and here in Bendigo and here in Australia. So this is the conversation that we're having today. Elliot, Fishman.
Yeah, look, I was just going to say that we started talking about this idea of what about smaller shuttles in smaller townships connecting into Bendigo. And there seems to be and it seems to make sense at first glance that a smaller public transport vehicle would be cost effective compared to a larger public transport vehicle. But in actual fact, when you look at the economics of providing a public transport service, the size of the vehicle is only a very minor contributor to the overall cost of providing that service. Primarily, it's about the driver and paying the driver. That's the operational cost of providing that service. So you don't make huge amounts of savings when you start shifting towards smaller vehicles. And it's also true that public transport services need to have carriages that are large enough to cater for peak demands. And when you've got peak demands that are going to exceed the carrying capacity of a smaller shuttle, then it minimises the benefits that would come from having a smaller public transport service. The other thing that we haven't spoken about this morning that I think is really critical to all of the issues that we've mentioned, and that is density, and the density of regional cities, and what we're doing to accommodate future populations. Are we going to put them on the edges on the margins of our regional cities, or are we going to try and infill development and try and focus those new populations within more established areas of townships that already have better public transport networks, that have more walkable opportunities, that are closer to people's destinations? And if we don't think about that, then we can't think about higher capacity public transport, because we're not going to have the population to support those services. So we need to be talking about density in regional cities.
So this is a crucial question for Bendigo and all regional cities, because one of the appeals of Bendigo is that people have large blocks, it's spread out, there's space, you're not living cheek by jowl as you are in a capital city. And so let's explore that a little further. That's a real challenge, isn't it, for a city like Bendigo? Sarah?
Yeah, we've done quite a lot of analysis into what makes a place walkable. And things like trees and shade definitely help, but they're not fundamental. So if you do want a walkable neighbourhood, then in fact there are 3 ingredients, so it's quite simple. The first key ingredient is that you do need to have a mix of things to see and do. So they're things like having local shops, having a local doctor or a local library, definitely local schools and small parks. So you need a mix of these different things that are within a short 15-minute walk from home. That's really important. The second most important ingredient is that you've got a mix of housing type. So I'm talking about duplexes, semi-detached houses, maybe some townhouses. Definitely not talking about high-rise. And you can have single dwellings amongst that, but you need a mix of housing type. And I think that's really important also for people who are downsizing, their kids have moved out, what are you going to do with this big house? So that gives people options of different places to live, and that's slightly increased density, not high density. And then the third key ingredient is having lots of crossing opportunities. So you talked about that big highway that goes through town. It's really important to be able to easily cross the road through having crossings, and also having quite small, what they call fine-grained networks. I know that's a very jargon-heavy word, but basically it just means that you've got quite small blocks, street blocks. Now, if you put those 3 ingredients together, that will account for more than half of all walking in a neighbourhood. So I think as you're getting that redevelopment or that new development occurring on the fringes of town, that's really important for council and developers to be pushing for those 3 ingredients to happen. I would also just add that the centre of Bendigo was developed way before cars, right? It's a gold rush era town, and so whilst you might not get that beautiful monumental architecture, the bones are there, but you might have to take some of the cars out in order to increase that walkability. So I guess that's what I sort of wanted to add around that density question.
We're getting fantastic questions coming in, and something relevant to that from Brendan is, what would be the appetite for pilot programs to close streets around schools during school times to make it safer for active travel? Marybeck, which is a council in Melbourne, does this.
I'm happy to quickly try and answer that. So I imagine that there'd be furious opposition to it as soon as it was proposed, and then if they did it, after 6 months or 12 months when you do the evaluation, people would be like, I can't remember what it was like before. It seems fine. So a lot of this is, the pain is in the change. It's when you're talking about changing the configuration of a street or the way in which a vehicle accesses different destinations. That is always controversial. It's controversial not just in Australian townships, but also overseas as well, even in places like the Netherlands and other parts of Northern Europe. But when you do it, then people can see the benefit of it and they're much more welcoming to it. But the talking about the change is where you're going to get the opposition, and it takes courage to go, we can understand there's opposition, but we're going to do it, but we're only going to do it as a trial, and we'll turn it back to what it was before if people don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt, I support everything Elliot just said then, and it does take leadership, it does take courage. We actually deliver a program on the Sunshine Coast where we've chipped 1,500 kids' bikes, and their parents get notified when they get to a desired level of location. We now, because we have that evidence, we have those numbers, we have the support of the families, we are now having exactly what Elliot's asking for. The parents are asking us to go further. They're asking us to do more about the infrastructure around their schools. At the start of that program, there wasn't that level of support, but 2 years into the program, they're understanding the benefits to their children, they're understanding the benefits to themselves. The greatest benefit we're getting out of that program is, yes, Sarah talks about independence of children, health of children, lifestyle of children. The parents are saying they get an extra hour and a half back in their day because they're no longer having to take their child to school and back again. So we now have parents driving those conversations. So it took tough leadership, and it does take tough leadership, but it is something that has a magical impact. We do see around the world car-free days that had significant pushback when they started, and they are now transitioning into much wider areas. I know we'll talk about international examples, but the way that international cities are leading this conversation, Paris, Milan, wherever, they are reducing the ability for people to drive, and the population pushed back, but are now celebrating.
Yes, how interesting. And I want to come to you on bikes because here we are in a low-density city, Bendigo, central Victoria. I think something like 2% of people ride bikes regularly or daily. I can't remember the exact figure now.
It's 0.9% of people in Bendigo say they use the bike to get to work. That's only for trips to work.
0.9%.
Yeah.
We'll come back to this, but in a town like Groningen in the Netherlands, which has 200,000 people, and that's what Bendigo is projected to have in 2050, 60% of people use bikes daily. So I think that's fascinating. But Peter Bourke, bikes are your thing, and Fee has asked, I would prefer to use a bike or scooter, but I don't feel safe on the road. Bike lanes end right where you need them most, just as you enter the centre of town. And then also someone's written, bike paths are not family friendly when they cross major roads with no pedestrian crossings. For example, this is for locals, the crossing at Lockwood Road, Kangaroo Flat. So, two vital questions here about the safety, the accessibility of cycling in this city.
We know that people would like to ride. There's an amazing amount of evidence, and the question from Fee, thank you. We know that they are challenged by the lack of infrastructure or the lack of connections. We know that we've quite often put in the infrastructure where it's easy to do, but the moment we're challenged, and whether that's taking out parking or prioritising active transport, walking, riding over the private motor vehicle, quite often the road engineer or anyone else is either forced to or makes the decision to prioritise a motor vehicle over a bike rider or a walker. And we also know that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So the moment that we have a missing piece of infrastructure, it cancels the trip. We know that. Bendigo did a survey, I think it was 2 years ago, and focusing on women's perceptions of cycling. I think it was 5% of women were comfortable riding on the road with no infrastructure, 20% were comfortable riding on the road with white painted bike lanes. So we've got 80% of the population, the female population in Bendigo, that is unwilling to ride on a painted bike lane.
Yeah. It's not enough, is it, to just have a painted bike lane, as there is on the main stretch in and out of Bendigo?
Absolutely, and Bendigo has got, I think it's about 400 kilometres of bike lanes. I think it is 400 kilometres. They've got 130 kilometres of separated, half of that is a rail trail. So in reality, out of 400 kilometres, we've got about 50 kilometres of separated bike lane. Dr. Ben Beck from Monash University made a paper 2 years ago that said that painted bike lanes are almost worse than not having bike lanes at all because of the way cars treat people in that. I
just saw a car swerve into a bike lane. They were going straight ahead, but they just did a little swerve into a bike lane and swerve out again.
Yeah, and I've had a look at, and obviously being local, I've looked at the bike plan, and the staff here have done some amazing work on developing the plans for the bike lane. Bendigo has amazing plans for safe, connected networks that get people where they want to go. I think the plan would be 95% of the population will be within 500 metres of a separated bike lane. It takes money, it takes leadership, and it takes courage for the political leaders to actually do that. And that is something where regional centres and all political leaders are faced with the decision about, do I go for something that is good, or do I go for something that is popular in the short term? And that is one thing that is a challenge for somewhere like Bendigo. The plans are in place, the knowledge is there, the staff are in place that know what to do, but the money is something they need. I mean, hopefully through the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games are a prime opportunity. We are showcasing regional centres, whether it's Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo. We're showcasing it. We should show what it could be, not what it should be, not what it has been for the last 50 years. And just one comment I will make also about Groningen. The Netherlands, everybody thinks that the Netherlands is a cycling mecca, and it is fantastic, and Elliot can talk to this because he'll be there in 2 weeks. In the 1970s, it was moving to a car culture until the population made an active decision to move, that they wanted to actually have a solution that supported women and men, supported children, it was a transport solution, it was a life solution. It wasn't a decision to ride bikes, it was a transport solution that they invested in.
Interesting.
They invest €19 per person per year in the major centres. I think we invest, €19 per state per year in total.
Yeah. Well, Sara, Stace, you've just come back from Europe and the Netherlands and Denmark, and so you were tweeting just wonderful photos illustrating how cities have been, towns have been, neighbourhoods have been designed in a sense, or have evolved to celebrate other ways of moving beyond the car. So describe some of the highlights for you from your travels.
Yeah, what I found really interesting was, yes, they've got their separated cycleways in the city centre.
And that's worked for shopkeepers as well?
That works for shopkeepers as well. In fact, what was really interesting is watching deliveries being done. So because you can't park, there's not a loading dock right outside the front of your shop or even out the back. So they might have to park around the corner, and then they get the cart and they cart it along the nice smooth cycleway to get to the shop. So in terms of logistics, there are solutions out there. You've also got cargo bikes that do delivery that can fit quite, a whole pallet on the back, for example. So that was really interesting from a logistics point of view. From a disability access point of view, again, we saw lots of people in wheelchairs, on their electric wheelchairs or motorised scooters, using the cycleways because it's nice and smooth. You're not having to go up and down curb ramps or go on a footpath and have tree roots, and all those obstacles actually disappear. But what I also found interesting was going through the suburban back streets, so not in the centre of town, but in the type of landscape that you see more of in Australian suburbs. And they're not putting in separated cycleways. What they have got is slow street speeds, so 30 kilometres an hour as a maximum, and in this case, quite hefty fines if you go over those speed limits. But the idea being, we can't afford to build cycleways everywhere. What we can afford to do is slow down the speed of cars so that they're a guest in the street, and kids are out there playing. They're playing, probably not cricket, but they're playing basketball and soccer and things like that. And the cars just drive slowly on every single suburban street with housing. That was fascinating. And as a result, you've got more kids playing in the street, you've got more people interacting with each other on the street and just chatting to neighbours. But then there's also, there's lots of cars, there's lots of parking, all those things are still present, but you've got other life in the street. And as a result, you do see people, seniors out riding bikes, you see teenagers going off to sport on their own, being independent, and that was what was really fascinating.
Well, and people transport all sorts of things on bikes. You really saw some great scenes, didn't you? All sorts of people
right. Yes.
Getting all sorts of places on bikes. What about when it's freezing cold or the snow is falling?
I might get Elliot to answer that one.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, look, the mode share, and mode share is just a fancy word for the proportion of trips done by different modes of transport. So in Bendigo, about 95% of trips are done by car, so the car mode share is 95%. But in the Netherlands, even in winter, on a day that's going to have sleet or rain, you'll still have a higher proportion of trips done by bike then than you would on a sunny day in a regional city in Australia. And so
is that about people just becoming habituated to riding, or is there infrastructure in people's workplaces, in the cities to accommodate that?
It's mainly, it's a combination of people being habituated to it, so the bike becomes their default mode of transport for some people, and so they'll ride it. But also one of the most popular apps in the Netherlands is a weather app, a weather radar app, so that they just very smartly time when they're going to leave the office to make sure that they miss a rain shower and that they might delay leaving work by 8 minutes in order to avoid getting wet. But also because they've got great bike infrastructure. Riding in the rain isn't terrible, but riding in the rain mixing with fast-moving motor vehicle traffic is terrible. And they don't have to do that in the Netherlands. So that helps. And then they've got good waterproof rain gear. So there's I think it's a Norwegian saying, which is there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothes. And the other Dutch saying that they've got is they're not made of sugar, so they don't melt when it rains. So there's less of a fear of getting wet in the rain, but it's also an environment where it's not as unpleasant to be wet riding as it might be if you're having to mix with motor vehicle traffic while you're on your bike.
I want to come to, we might come back to all of these questions, but I want to come to electric vehicles because a lot of you are asking questions about electric vehicles. We're seeing incredibly interesting trends in electric vehicles in the last couple of years. A seventh of cars sold in the world were electric vehicles in 2022. That compares to 1 in 70 cars sold being electric vehicles back in 2017. That's not that long ago. Last year, 14% of all new cars sold were electric in the world. There's been a 60% increase in China. In Europe, more than 1 in 5 cars sold now are electric. In the USA, an increase of 55% in electric vehicles being sold. In Australia, 4% of cars sold were electric vehicles. So let's come to that, because lots of questions here about all sorts of things. So affordability, the infrastructure, the incentives. Let's start with affordability. Connor has asked, knowing that Victoria is living in an economic crisis, how can we make electric vehicles more affordable to the public? Elliot Fishman.
Yep, so electric vehicles will become more affordable to the public for 2 principal reasons. One is that the cost of production is decreasing, and so because most of the cost of an electric car, or at least around half the cost of an electric car, is actually the battery. So you need quite a big battery. It's usually about 60 kilowatt hours or so, 60 to 70 kilowatt hours. So as the cost comes down from manufacturing, because of economies of scale, where you've got big car manufacturers starting to retool their factories in order to provide a higher rate of electric vehicle production, that will bring down the cost. But also as vehicles come onto the second-hand market, because only about 50% of vehicles sold are new vehicles. A lot of them are second-hand vehicles. A lot of people go their whole life never buying a new vehicle outright. They'll buy second-hand vehicles. And so as fleets start to shift, that fleets usually hold their vehicles for between 3 and 5 years, then they put them onto the second-hand market. So buying a second-hand electric vehicle will become more available and more affordable. So
that's absolutely key, though, isn't it? Because I've never bought a new car. I will never buy a new car. I've never spent more than, I don't know, probably about $7,000 on a car, and I keep cars for 15 years. I know I'm a climate liability right there. I do have an e-bike. But this is a reality. People cannot afford new cars. We need to see the second-hand market being flooded with affordable electric vehicles. Do you imagine a future where that might happen?
Yes, and that's already starting to happen. So if you look at the number of second-hand electric vehicles a year ago, on carsales.com or something like that, it was only maybe 200 vehicles, and now that's dramatically increased. So people that bought electric vehicles in 2014 and 15 are selling them on the second-hand market and buying a new one, because you can get a lot more for your money today than you could 4 or 5 years ago. But also a lot of state government and local government fleets are now, they've got procurement goals of creating a zero-emission fleet by 2030. So that means that most of the vehicles that they're going to need to buy by about 2024, 2025 are going to have to be EV. And when they come onto the second-hand market, you just get this massive flow of more affordable vehicles. So I think that will happen. In terms of state subsidies, I think we're starting to see a reduction in the need for them. So places like Norway, which has now 88% of all new vehicles sold in Norway are electric, so they're by far and away the world leader.
And Norway has also banned petrol cars by 2035.
Yes, that's right, and there are a number of European countries that have done that. I think the ACT have said that they're going to ban the sale of new petrol or diesel cars by 2035, and they actually have 21% of all new vehicles sold in the ACT were electric, and that's partly because of the huge government fleets that are there. So it says something about the way in which this is moving, that so many government fleets are now shifting towards EV, that you can get 1 in 5 new cars sold in the ACT being EV already.
Elliot, there's the question of subsidies, but in Victoria, an electric vehicle tax was introduced in 2021, and it certainly came under attack from the electric vehicle industry, as you'd imagine. But is that a significant impediment to e-vehicle ownership? It seems to not make sense to many people that you would actually create a disincentive for people to buy electric vehicles.
So I'm always a little bit embarrassed when people bring up the EV tax in Victoria, and the reason I'm embarrassed is because we had a fairly robust discussion in the office about this, and I had taken the position that it was a bad idea, and then I was convinced by one of my colleagues that actually it was a good idea. Ooh. And the reason I'm embarrassed is because I actually wrote an op-ed piece that was published in one of the major daily newspapers saying how much I was against this tax, and then 24 hours later my colleague brought me around to the complete opposite, and I realised that I was wrong.
So what was the revelation that you had? And so, it is great to be porous to changing your views, isn't it?
It is, and the reason I was won over by my colleague was because at the moment only 1% or less of the vehicles on the road are EV. Now, we need to have a road user charge, because what's going to happen in the future is, at the moment you pay about 40 cents for every litre of petrol that you buy or diesel, and it goes to it's a fuel excise, and it goes to the Commonwealth Government, and so it's a tax that raises about $18 billion a year, so it's a lot of money. And as more and more people buy EVs, that's a way of avoiding that tax. So that's going to create a shortfall in revenue for government, which will mean a reduction in the amount of revenue available for important government services. So the reason it's important to put in the road user charge is because politically it's almost impossible to implement a road user charge if it applies to everyone from day one, whereas now, if you put it in, it only applies to a small number of people, so it's politically achievable, and then over the course of 15 or 20 years, as we convert towards EVs, everyone will end up paying it. But the point is, and this is crucial, is that it does not reduce the number of EVs sold. So at the moment in Victoria, if you drive an EV, you pay 2.5 cents per kilometre travelled. Now, when you look at the sales stats, a year after that was introduced in Victoria, EV sales haven't reduced on their trend of purchasing compared to the other states that hadn't brought in the tax. So it hasn't diminished sales. It only costs about $300 a year. So if you're going to buy a $70,000 electric vehicle, $300 a year isn't that much, and the economics of it still makes sense. It's not diminished by the relatively small $300 a year charge that most EV motorists would have to pay. So basically, if you drive more, you should pay more. If you drive less, you should pay less. And that's what a road user tax does. And even though Victoria was the first state to implement it, all the other states will follow. It's just a question of time.
An interesting question here from the audience. Are you worried the new guilt-free electric car will increase car usage and kilometres? And this is an issue, this rebound effect, isn't it? That well, we're doing the right thing. I've got, this person might say, I've got an electric vehicle, I'm fine climate-wise. So
that is real, and I know that it's real because my family have recently purchased an electric vehicle, and now when we take my daughter to soccer training on a rainy Thursday night in Melbourne, we'll be much more likely to drive than we would have before. We would always leave our car at home for those sorts of trips. Now there's this idea, well, it's emissions free, so we'll just use it. So if my family are doing that, I suspect that other families might think about that as well.
What about driving range? Just before I come to Peter on the question of more cars, more EV vehicles mean more cars. What does that mean for other users of the roads? Elliot, what about driving range? Because for people in Bendigo and other regional cities who want to travel between regional cities, at the moment we simply do not have sufficient infrastructure.
Yeah, so one of the really
charging stations.
Yep, so one of the really important things that isn't clear to people until maybe they get an EV is that about 95% of all charging actually happens at home. So most people will have a driveway and a garage in Bendigo, and if you do, the easiest place for you to charge up will be your home. And you can either just plug an EV into an ordinary power point, or you can spend $1,000 or $2,000 and get a dedicated charger. You can also just carry a charger with you. So if you go and visit your family or grandparents or something in another township, you can just take the charger and plug into their socket when you get to their house and charge up. It's a slow charge. You only add about 10 kilometres per hour of charging, but it's enough if you're staying there overnight that you'll have a decent charge in your battery to go. To give you another example, I drove up from Melbourne this morning, and I can just get from Melbourne to Bendigo and back in one charge. So it's about 350 kilometres is what you get on a charge. But one of the important things that it differentiates EVs from petrol or diesel cars in terms of range is that you get more range, as everybody knows, with a petrol or diesel car on the highway. So if you're doing country driving, you get longer range with petrol or diesel. With electric vehicles, it's the opposite. So you actually get the longest range in townships when you're doing stop-start driving, and you get shorter range when you're travelling 110 on the freeway. So that can get a lot of people unstuck when they get on the open road for the first time in an EV.
We clearly need more electric vehicle infrastructure, and there is a call for 100% of us to be driving electric vehicles at some point. Peter Bourke, though, more electric vehicles and more people deciding that, well, no, I don't need to walk, or I can just take my EV to the supermarket. What does that mean for you as a bike rider?
Absolutely, and it is a concern because it's not necessarily more electric vehicles, it's just more vehicles in general, because if we're replacing an internal combustion engine or an ICE engine with an electric vehicle, it's still a vehicle. So we're still talking about, the question before was about the separated connected bike paths. We still need these because it doesn't matter whether it's an EV and energy efficient, it'll still hurt if you get hit by a car. It doesn't change the safety element, it doesn't change the health benefits, it doesn't change congestion, it just simply changes the level of emissions that are being produced on that individual trip.
And God help us when driverless electric vehicles become a norm.
Well, that's a whole nother philosophical debate, and I've had this discussion with Elliot a couple of times, and so my mind has been changed several times, as his probably has, through debates on where I sit on that. So driverless cars are certainly something that will have an impact on walking and cycling. I just want to add one other quick thing on. Elliot mentioned that a big component of the price of a car is the battery. One stat that always gels in my head is, of the 40,000 e-vehicles sold last year, they have the same level of batteries as if we produced 7 million e-bikes for Australia. So 40,000 cars, 6 to 7 million e-bikes. So we could actually have, you know, an e-bike, in 3 years, those cars could give an e-bike to everyone in Australia. So they take a lot of energy to produce, a lot of energy for that battery, and we do have other solutions that we could use with that.
E-bikes are phenomenal. I think I could become an evangelist for e-bikes. I just have a really little cheap one that's a fold-up, it's entry level, it's not waterproof, that's how cheap it was. And it just is a revelation to me, actually. Yeah. It's so much fun to ride. That's the key for me.
Could I just to add to that, and you've made a really relevant point, e-bikes are fantastic for transport, they're really good for your health because you still get health benefits, but the key we hear over and over again is that they are fun. And when half the trips in Bendigo or regional centres are less than 4.5 k's, an e-bike will generally get you there in the same time frame as a car, but you'll have fun doing it.
It's fun. Oh. Sara, Stace, it's fun, isn't it? Arian has asked, do you agree that there is stigma around bike riders? In my experience, many drivers hate cyclists. Now, this is an interesting question to ask because we're talking about, and someone else has asked, how do we achieve all this? So let's get to that. But we're talking about infrastructure, but we're also talking about cultural change, social change, and a change of minds, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, it's a vexed question. We actually try and avoid using the word cyclist because it carries a lot of associations with your mammal riders. That's your middle-aged men in Lycra. And
it's cool.
So
if you are a middle-aged man in Lycra, you just be you. You do you.
And so that when we use the word cyclist, it often conjures that image in your mind. You're not thinking about a 3-year-old on a tricycle or on a little one of those little pedal things that they wander along. So I don't consider myself a cyclist at all, but I do ride a bicycle every day to go from A to B. I don't even ride a bike recreationally. For me, it's just a tool to get from one point to another. So I think that often that framing is really important. I'd say that when we're designing for cycling infrastructure, in the past we have tended to think that putting a bike logo in the middle of a road is enough, but it's not. That does not add any safety whatsoever. As Peter pointed out, Dr. Ben Beck from Monash University studied that and found it has no safety effect. So when we are designing cycleways, we really need to be thinking about a 12-year-old being able to ride a bicycle by themselves on that infrastructure. That's kind of the standard that we want to be doing. And that's because in Victoria and New South Wales, up until quite recently, I think, we required that a 12-year-old must ride on the road. They can't ride on a footpath. I think that's changed slightly. I think in New South Wales it's now 16. Has that changed in Victoria?
It's 13 in Victoria.
13, okay. So your 13-year-old isn't allowed to ride on the footpath. They have to ride on the road. That means we need to make that road safe enough for a 13-year-old to ride by themselves. So,
and what parent would let their 13-year-old ride on a busy main road these days? I mean, we all did it when we were kids, but, life was different then.
I have a 13-year-old and, he's not ready. So, but then in 4 years' time, he's going to be able to get a driver's licence and drive a car.
Eek.
And that worries me as well because we know that young drivers, particularly young males, are in fact more dangerous. So there's a real schism there in the way we're thinking about safety and the way we're thinking about what's appropriate on our roads. So coming back to that term about whether or not motorists don't like cyclists, etc. If you do start to get that step change occurring, well, one is you want to separate so that you're not creating as much conflict between riders and cars. But the second one, and you can do that through things like slowing the speeds down to 30, because if someone is hit by a motor vehicle at 30 kilometres an hour, they have, I think, a 95% chance of survival, whereas if that car is going just 10 kilometres faster, the survival rate drops to just 50%. So there's a massive, massive step change in the survival of a child being hit by a car or a person riding a bike or any member of public being hit by a car at that 30. So that's really, really important. And it won't add particularly more to your travel time driving because by the time you get to an arterial road, that might increase up to 50 or 60. I will just add though, in Bendigo, a lot of roads here are still 60, even though the default urban speed limit is 50. So around Australia, but we do have things like 40 kilometres around school times. I think that we really need to make that major step change down to 30 kilometres an hour, not just for bike riders, but for our kids, for our seniors and elderly, for anyone who wants to walk.
Major adjustment for a low-density city like Bendigo, though, and that's a real changing of minds, isn't it? And a making and a breaking of habits.
Yeah, I mean, look, hands up, audience. Do you remember when we went from 60 to 50 as the default urban speed limit in Australia? It was in the early 90s. Did you get consulted on that? Did you get asked? No, it just happened, right? So we accepted that. People didn't like it at the time, but we adjusted. And I wasn't a driver then, but I watched my parents doing it. And then, so people don't like it up front, but I think we just, we want to have Vision Zero. We want to achieve climate goals. We want our kids to be able to walk on the street. So the whole of Wales, for example, has gone to 30 kilometres an hour, an entire country. But again, the way it works is that you've got your local street is 30 kilometres an hour, and then once you get to an arterial road, which is usually no more than 3 minutes away, then you can drive faster.
So Michelle has written, until the early 1970s, trams ran right across Bendigo to Eaglehawk. You could get to school or work easily. Why can't tourist trams do this again? And then also someone's written, public transport must form part of the solution, not the solution. It will never win compared solely to the car. So it's a combination of active plus public transport plus sustainable vehicles, so electric vehicles. And Bendigo, one goal that's been set as part of the climate collaboration that's happening here is a 30-30-30 split. So a third of trips involving some kind of active transport like walking or riding or e-scooters, 1/3 by public transport and 1/3 by electric vehicles by 2030. How do we realise a combination so that everyone's got a choice to take the sustainable transport form that best suits them at a particular time of their life or particular time of their week? Elliot, Fishman, is there a conversation about multiple modes of transport? How do you resource that to happen?
Yeah, well, it's a huge challenge. I mean, to get to that 30% of trips by active transport and 30% by public transport in any regional city in Australia is always going to be a huge challenge, because at the moment, as we've talked about before, 95% of trips are done by car. I think what we can do is look at what's world's best practice and look at small cities that are similar size to either where Bendigo is now or where it might be in the coming years. And we mentioned Groningen in the Netherlands a few moments ago, and I'll be there in a couple of weeks leading a study tour there. And one of the things that they did, and it's important to look at a city like Groningen because of the similar population size, what they did in the early 1970s was they overnight said, you can't drive through the centre of town. You can drive into the centre of town, but then you have to go back the way you came. And they did it really simply with putting huge boulders in the centre of the street, and they had people with a huge bucket of flowers, and they gave motorists the flower when they got to the roadblock and said, okay, sorry, you're going to have to go back the way you came. And they knew that by giving flowers, it's very difficult to get angry with somebody if they're giving you a flower. So that worked really well. And after a couple of years of running that system, they did an evaluation, and it hadn't achieved the goals that they had set out to achieve. And so they had two choices. They could either go back the way they were and remove the boulders and let drivers go through the centre of town like they used to, or they could take it even further and do more roadblocks and more innovative transport solutions. And they decided to go with the more innovative transport solutions. And so now 60% of trips in Groningen are done by bicycle, and it's a world leader. And so people like me take international delegations to Groningen to take a look at what's happening. And the other thing that they do is they integrate different forms of sustainable transport. So they have great walking environments around their train stations. They have dedicated bicycle facilities that link in with the public transport network, and they can also allow bikes to be carried on public transport vehicles.
Brilliant, so it's all connected.
It's all connected, it's all integrated. They also have, and this is something that's going to be challenging for some communities, they have very strict parking management. So you have to pay for parking almost everywhere, and they have a fairly strict regime in terms of permits, and it's not easy to park there. So, and that's important because you'll never get to 30% of trips by active transport and 30% of trips by, or a third of trips by public transport, unless you've also got a quite difficult way in which to park. Unless you structure a parking regime that manages car parking demand or manages car use, then you won't get to that a third mode target that you've got. A place like Bendigo and other regional cities, one really simple thing that you could do is on your buses, put bike racks on the front of buses. And I know that a lot of places in Victoria, and I know that the ACT has been doing this for over a decade, and the great thing about that is it's not that you put your bike on the bus every day, it's that you've got that safety net that you can do that if you need to. So if you're a new cyclist, you're concerned that you might get a flat tyre or your chain comes off and you're not sure how to put it back on, you can always put your bike on the front of the bus to get to where you need to go.
Sounds amazing. And lots of questions here, and I've tried to be looking across the themes of the questions and integrating them into various parts of our conversation. So thank you so much for these terrific questions. It's really helped me guide the discussion. And I want to round now, finally, as we wrap, back to the local, Peter Bourke of We Bike Australia and Bendigo, Bike Bendigo. How are you hearing this conversation? How do you imagine? So in 3 years' time, Bendigo is going to be hosting the Commonwealth Games. You will be, amongst other regional cities in Victoria, you're going to be there on the world stage, accommodating people from around the region and beyond, from the Commonwealth. What do you think could make everything that we've heard today possible? Clearly, investment from state governments and local governments. What needs to happen to enable this vision for a zero emissions transport system in a town like Bendigo?
It actually is a simple answer, and that is leadership. And you mentioned Commonwealth Games, and the numbers are, I think, there's the bike plan, as an example, has got $140 million worth of bike infrastructure over the next 30 years, $40 million over 10. The plans are there. We've listened to two fantastic experts with Sara and Elliot talking about Australia and international best practice. We know what actually has to happen. We've got Commonwealth Games in 3 years, or 2026. This is the opportunity to internationally showcase Bendigo as a world leader. It is the opportunity to do things. We know we're doing the centre of Bendigo is going to be car-free for a period. It is our chance to test, trial, to experience. But it is that. But if Bendigo wants to be a truly leading city and not just a country town in the future, the leaders need to make the difficult decisions and say we are going to invest in both the programs and the infrastructure that actually provide the options for tourists, for locals to actually move around our towns and not be reliant upon a private motor vehicle. So Commonwealth Games is our target, and that's our chance to do things and then keep it going from then.
The reality is, though, that you have to actually think over decades outside of the short-term political cycle. You need to have a shared bipartisan vision for what could be possible for a town.
Without a doubt, and they've done really well, whether it's the ITLIS or integrated transport land use strategy, their bike plans, their parking plans. There's a lot of documentation that have actually been developed. It's now just a case of actually engaging, embracing. We've seen at a state level, they've got their climate change strategy, 2021. I think the Act was in 2017, the strategy was 2021. They've just released their latest snapshot, 2023. Unfortunately, it did not mention walking or riding once. So what we've got is this situation where we've got a lot of plans being developed and a lot of structures over a long period of time. We've actually got to do something around them, action plans, and deliver on what those plans actually are.
What do you reckon? Let's thank Sara, Stace, Elliot, Fishman and Peter Bourke, and to the fantastic team who have organised today's Climate Summit here in Bendigo. Thank you so much for being here.